All right, let's dive right into this explainer and unpack the truly fascinating cause and effect story of Nigeria's economic transformation. We're looking at a nation that essentially stumbled into immense, unprecedented wealth, a massive shift that fundamentally altered its identity, its physical landscape, and honestly, its future forever.
So here's our roadmap for understanding how all this sudden wealth completely reshaped the nation. We're going to cover the Black Gold Rush, then look at the resource curse, move on to indigenization and nationalization, discuss the Niger Delta crisis, and finally wrap up with deregulation and anti-corruption.
Starting us off with Section 1, the Black Gold Rush, from agriculture to petrodollars.
I want you to picture Nigeria before the late 1950s. The economy was deeply rooted in traditional agriculture. You had peasant communities operating broadly on a barter system, basically focusing on food crops and rearing animals. But then, enter the 1970s. The commercialization of crude oil absolutely transformed the landscape. That agrarian focus, completely abandoned for a petrodollar economy, which sparked these grandiose ambitions for massive highways, huge hospitals, and state-of-the-art universities.
And you really have to see the sheer volume of this revenue jump to believe it. Between 1958 and 2006, the nation saw an incredible 29.8 trillion naira pour straight into government coffers. Sparked by global oil scarcity and, skyrocketing prices, the 1970s oil boom handed the government immense capital. So suddenly, a farming nation was dealing with literally billions of petrodollars. This drastically increased public spending and transformed city topographies almost overnight. It's like a completely different world.
But as you might guess, that massive wealth created a pretty dangerous imbalance. Crude oil and its associated products completely swallowed up the country's total trade. This heavy reliance on a single, highly volatile and capital-intensive sector meant it just didn't employ the masses in the same way agriculture did. And this singular focus, well, it set the stage for some deeply complex economic challenges down the line.
Which brings us right into Section 2, the resource curse, the unintended consequences.
Now, there's this really provocative metaphor economists use here, acquired import dependency syndrome. It perfectly encapsulates the dark side of the boom. As the government fixated on all that lucrative oil, vital sectors like agriculture and manufacturing faced severe, almost total neglect. The country basically stopped producing its own goods, using its shiny new wealth to import almost everything. Think about it. A nation that used to easily feed itself actually started importing basic staples like palm oil and groundnuts. Crazy, right?
And here's where the reality really hits the everyday consumer. With local farming pushed to the side, domestic food prices ballooned by an astonishing 273% in less than a decade, between 1973 and 1981. The government tried to offset this by slashing tariffs, trying to flood the market with cheap imports, but honestly, that just discouraged local farmers even more. Greater consumption, fueled by all that oil money, simply drove inflation higher and higher, which just completely eroded the real income of everyday citizens.
This dynamic actually shifted the very nature of the government itself, creating what economists call a rentier state. Now, this is a crucial takeaway if you want to understand global petro-state economics. In a typical country, a government relies on taxing its citizens, right? That creates a necessary loop of accountability. But here, the bulk of revenue came from outside the country, through rents, basically royalties paid by massive multinational oil corporations. When leaders rely on foreign corporate money instead of citizen taxes, it really paves the way for widespread corruption, completely devoid of public accountability.
Moving on to Section 3, indigenization and nationalization, reclaiming the wealth.
To try and counteract this overwhelming foreign dominance, the government actively centralized control throughout the 1970s. It happened fast. In 1971, Nigeria created the National Oil Corporation and joined OPEC. The very next year, the Nigerian indigenization decree was promulgated, and by 1978, the Land Use Decree transferred land and mineral rights away from local populations directly to the state. This gave the federal government immense, highly centralized power over basically all resources.
Let's look a bit closer at that 1972 indigenization decree. It was a deliberate, calculated policy to stop capital flight. It actually broke foreign ownership down into 3 very strict schedules. Schedule 1 mandated 100% Nigerian ownership for local businesses, think advertising and bread making. Schedule 2 required 60% local ownership for capital-intensive sectors like banking. And Schedule 3 demanded at least 40% equity in highly technical areas like fertilizer production. The goal here was simple: retain economic control, keep the profits at home, and create a brand new crop of Nigerian entrepreneurs.
Which leads us to the heavy realities in Section 4. The Niger Delta crisis, the cost of black gold.
Now, while these massive macroeconomic policies shifted wealth around in the capital, the reality on the ground, right where the oil was actually being extracted, was just catastrophic. Between 1956 and 2008, there were over 4,800 reported oil spills in the Niger Delta. Literally millions of barrels of crude oil bled into the ecosystem, absolutely devastating the mangrove swamp forests and effectively destroying the local farming and fishing industries that these communities completely relied on for their survival.
And the tragic irony here is profound. You'd naturally assume that the regions producing this incredible wealth would be absolutely thriving, right? Yet major oil-producing states like Delta and Bayelsa suffered massive, heartbreaking poverty rates. This stark neglect and underdevelopment by the federal government fostered intense intergroup conflicts, youth militancy, and pipeline vandalization, as locals basically had to fight for a share of the resources being extracted right out of their own backyards.
This brings us to our final part, Section 5. Deregulation and anti-corruption, changing course. So this leads us to a really critical question for this explainer. How do you even begin to correct an economic system suffering from decades of such deep-rooted complications? Like, how do you undo the side effects of rigid nationalization that historically led to so many inefficiencies and just massive political interference? Well, one major approach was deregulation, essentially pulling back that heavy state control of the nationalization era. By reducing government oversight and handing operations back over to the private sector, the goal is to encourage healthy market competition. It's designed to give consumers way more choices, reduce bureaucratic red tape, and ultimately save costs. It is a very deliberate step away from that centralized rentier state model we talked about, moving toward a much more liberalized, competitive economy.
But as we all know, deregulation without enforcement is basically a recipe for disaster. So, alongside economic liberalization, the state established some pretty powerful anti-corruption watchdogs. The EFCC was created in 2003 specifically to hunt down financial crimes and money laundering. The ICPC was set up to root out corrupt practices within public bodies, and agencies like NAFDAC were strengthened to regulate food and drug safety, ensuring that a free market didn't suddenly lead to a dangerous drop in quality for everyday consumers. I'll leave you with this final, provocative thought to ponder. As Nigeria continues to navigate its incredibly vast natural wealth, will modern deregulation and anti-corruption measures finally transform the resource curse into a lasting, equitable blessing? It's an ongoing journey, for sure, a really delicate balance of incredible natural resources and responsible governance. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.